Hello, everybody. This is Dr. Karen's, and this is the first of my lectures about the respiratory system. So, first, let's do a brief overview of the respiratory system before we get into the topic of this particular lecture. So, the major functions of the respiratory system is really coming down to transport of gases, particularly oxygen and carbon dioxide. So, what we were talking about earlier with the circulatory system, we had said the point of that system really was to get oxygen to your tissues. Well, we need the respiratory system to work hand in hand with this in order to even get that oxygen into our blood to begin with. So, both of these systems are going to be working hand in hand to achieve this goal. We also need to get rid of carbon dioxide. Remember, all of our cells, they're metabolizing, they're doing aerobic cellular respiration. Carbon dioxide is a byproduct and it's poisonous to our cells. So we need a way to get it out of our cells, which is what the circulatory system is going to do, but then also get it out of our body, which is what the respiratory system is going to do. The main processes of respiration: pulmonary ventilation, that is our actual breathing, moving air in and out of our lungs. And then external respiration. And this has to do with gas exchange. How do we get the oxygen from the air that is now in our lungs into our blood? How do we move the carbon dioxide that's in the blood out of the blood and into the lungs? These two processes are more specifically the job of the respiratory system. The circulatory system is going to help take care of the rest, which is transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood, getting that oxygen to our tissues, taking the carbon dioxide away from our tissues, and then internal respiration, which is gas exchange again. But now we're talking about gas exchange between the blood and our tissues. So we're trying to get oxygen out of that freshly oxygenated blood, get it out of the blood, and get it into our tissue cells, pick up that carbon dioxide from the tissue cells, and get it into our blood. Some basics of respiratory system anatomy. We've got structures in place that are part of the upper respiratory system, and then structures in place that are part of the lower respiratory system. Ultimately, the job of the upper respiratory system is to get air to our lungs. Parts of the lower respiratory system are going to do that as well. We are ultimately trying to get air to our lungs. As you are learning all these structures for lab and you're looking at our lab exam study guide, pay attention to which structures are part of the upper respiratory system, what parts are part of the lower respiratory system, but also take note of the tissue types in both the upper and respiratory system structures, because the tissue type will change, particularly as you move deeper and deeper into the lower respiratory system. And if you understand how the different tissues in general function, and you understand the jobs of the different structures within the upper and lower respiratory system, then the tissue type lining these structures will make sense. So pay attention to that. Okay, so we are going to jump ahead here. And the topic of this lecture today is going to focus on the mechanics of breathing. Okay. So again, we're going to be focusing on at least really the first process of these four processes in this particular lecture. So just recall what I had mentioned a few minutes ago. The four main processes of respiration: pulmonary ventilation, external respiration, the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide in the blood, and then internal respiration. So this lecture is going to focus only on pulmonary ventilation or actual breathing. And we've got two phases to that. We have inspiration or inhalation, or gases flowing into our lungs, air, and then expiration or exhalation, gases and air are flowing out of the lungs. And so it may seem that this process, what's going on is that you are actually pulling air into the lungs and pushing air out, but it's not quite how that's happening. So, really, to understand what's going on here, we need to consider the volume of our lungs and then also different air pressures. In particular, the pressure of the atmosphere, so the atmospheric pressure, there's oxygen and carbon dioxide there, and then also the pressure of the air inside our lungs. So when you are completely at rest and you are not breathing in or out, pressure of the atmosphere is going to be equal to this intrapulmonary pressure or the pressure inside the lungs. And if those two pressures are different, pressures kind of act like concentration and concentration gradients. So what we know about that, what? Things are always going to move from an area of high concentration to an area of low concentration. Well, that's going to be the same for air and for the gases in that air. Gases are always going to move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So if the atmospheric pressure outside and the pressure of the air inside our lungs, or that intrapulmonary pressure, if those pressures are not equal, they want to achieve equilibrium. And so the air in either the atmosphere or the lungs, depending on where the pressure is higher, air is always going to move from an area of high pressure to low pressure. So we're going to see this in a second. Some other pressures to consider is the pressure of this pleural cavity. The pleural cavity, remember, there's a space in between the lungs and the pleural coverings surrounding the lungs. There's a space there and there's a pressure in there. There's an air pressure in there. We want that pressure to always be less than the pressure inside the lungs, because if it's not, your lungs are going to collapse. So let's look at a picture of this. So in this example, the lung has been punctured, yet that pleural cavity has been punctured. And imagine that knife is actually a straw. And air is flowing now from outside and getting into that pleural cavity. So that intrapleural pressure is now increasing. There's more air filling up that pleural cavity, pushing down on the walls of the lungs, and that's going to cause the lungs to collapse. So this again is just illustrating that there's multiple compartments in the lungs that we have to consider air pressure, and we want that intrapleural space, we want that air pressure to be lower than it is in the lungs at all times, because if it's not, it's going to cause this issue right here with the lungs collapsing. All right, so in general, when we are breathing in and out, the things we need to consider are the pressure of the atmosphere compared to the pressure of the lungs, the intrapulmonary pressure. And then we also need to consider the volume of the lungs, because movement of air in and out of our lungs has to do with the volume of your lungs and what it does to the pressure of the air in your lungs. If you took general chemistry, this may sound familiar to you. Boyle's law. It's talking about the relationship between pressure and volume of a gas. So gases are always going to fill a container that they're in, and they're always going to be pushing on the walls of that container. That's the pressure of those gases within that container. If you increase the volume of that container, there's more room for those gases to move around, and so the pressure of those gases is going to go down. Increase the volume, the pressure goes down. If you decrease the volume of that container, there's less room for the gases in that container to be moving around, and they're going to push up on the walls of that container even more. So when you decrease the volume of a container, the pressure of the gases in that container is going to go up. So pressure and volume within a container are always going to be inversely proportional to one another. This is what's happening in our lungs. So when you are doing quiet inspiration or inhalation, you're probably doing that right now. You're just normally breathing in and out. You're not thinking about it. When you are breathing in, there are muscles that are being activated, namely the diaphragm, which is that muscle right under the lungs, and your external intercostals. Those are all contracting. So in this image, this is showing you exactly what's happening when you are breathing in. Normal, quiet breathing in. Diaphragm contracts and will actually move down, whereas the external intercostals are contracting and they are lifting the rib cage up. The effect of the action of these muscles is to increase the volume of your thoracic cage. That increases the volume of your lungs. So before you inhaled and you were just sitting there, not breathing at all, the pressure of the air in your lungs was equal to the pressure of the air in the atmosphere. And as soon as you breathe in, what's happening? The breathing in is actually changing the volume of your lungs. Diaphragm contracts, external intercostals contract. The effect is it increases the volume of your lungs. Well, increasing the volume of your lungs is going to decrease the pressure of your lungs because volume and pressure are inversely related. So that intrapulmonary pressure is decreasing. It is no longer equal to the atmospheric pressure. And so now the pressure of the atmosphere is greater than the pressure inside the lungs. We have a gradient. Pressures always want to reach equilibrium. The gases in those two areas are going to move down their pressure gradient. Think of it like a concentration gradient. So if there's more pressure in the atmosphere than in the lungs, then air is going to move from the atmosphere into the lungs. So when you're breathing in, you're not really pulling in air. You are just increasing the volume of your lungs, and air is passively moving down its pressure gradient into the lungs. If you were to try and take an even deeper breath in, which we call forced inspiration, this requires additional muscles, your scalenes, your sternocleidomastoid, and your pectoralis minor. The result is you're going to increase the thoracic cage volume and your lung volume even more, and so more air is going to come into your lungs. The opposite happens when you exhale. So when you're doing quiet expiration or quiet exhalation, and you're just, as what you're doing right now, sitting here listening to this, you don't engage any other muscles. Instead, the diaphragm and external intercostals simply relax. And when they do that, that means the volume of the thoracic cage and therefore the volume of the lungs goes down. Everything's going back into place. That once expanded lung volume is now going back to what it was before. So the volume of the lungs is decreasing, which increases the pressure in the lungs or increases the ultrapulmonary pressure. And that means that the pressure in the lungs is now greater than the pressure of the atmosphere. Air is going to move down its pressure gradient. So now, because the pressure in the lungs is more than what it is in the atmosphere, pressure is going to move, air is going to move from the lungs to the atmosphere, and you breathe out. If you want to even force even more air out, you engage actual muscles to do that. The obliques and the transverse abdominal muscles and the intercostals, internal intercostals. This graph here is just basically showing you what I just said. So when you are inhaling, doing quiet inspiration, the pressure in the lungs, that intrapulmonary pressure, not only does that go down because the volume of your lungs has increased, it is now less than what it is compared to the atmospheric pressure. And so air moves from the atmosphere into your lungs. When you're doing quiet expiration, the intrapulmonary pressure goes up because the volume of your lungs has gone down and is now greater than atmospheric pressure. So air is going to move from the lungs to the atmosphere. There are some factors that can affect how easy it is for that air to flow. And these factors are airway resistance, alveolar surface tension, and lung compliance. Resistance, I I don't really even have to say a whole lot about that. That just makes sense, right? If there's something blocking your airway, even partially, it's going to make it harder for air to flow, either flowing in or flowing out. That makes more sense. Alveolar surface tension, that takes a little more description. So go back and look at what those alveoli look like. They're like little balloons, and the alveoli are what is making up your lungs. So your lungs are organized into these alveoli. They look like bunches of balloons, and they are. They inflate as air enters the lungs, and then they'll deflate when air leaves the lungs. But there's water that lines those alveolar walls, and if left to its own devices, that would make those alveolar walls, the alveoli in your lungs, it would make them completely collapse and stick to one another every time you exhaled. That does not happen. We don't want it to happen because if those alveolar walls completely collapse and stick to one another, it is almost impossible to reinflate them. We would not have enough energy to keep breathing. So instead, to kind of combat this surface tension, our body makes surfactant, which is kind of like it's soapy a little bit and slippery. And it's made and it's in the lungs, it's in those alveoli. It lines the walls and it helps prevent those alveolar walls from completely collapsing and sticking to one another every time you exhale. We start making surfactant at around, I want to say around 28 or 29 weeks in fetal development, maybe 30 weeks in fetal development. If you are born or if a baby is born before that time, they're not making surfactant. And so it's really difficult, and in most cases, impossible for them to breathe on their own. They're going to need a respirator. They'll be in the NICU, obviously, and they'll need a respirator, and in many cases, they will get administered surfactant, until they can start producing it on their own. All right, so we talked about airway restriction or airway resistance. That's gonna affect how easily it is to move air in and out of the lungs. Surface tension makes it, impossible to move air in and out of the lungs without surfactant. And then the last thing that affects ventilation is lung compliance. This has to do with how stretchy are your lungs. The stretchier they are, the easier it is for them to inflate and when you increase the volume of the thoracic cage. So the easier it will be to increase the lung volume during inhalation and allow air to move in. What can affect compliance or how stretchy your lungs are? If you've got scar tissue on your lungs, that scar tissue is not gonna be completely the same as the healthy tissue, and it's not gonna be as stretchy. If you're not producing surfactant, you're not gonna be able to inflate those lungs. And even if your thoracic cage has lost flexibility for whatever reason, if you can't increase the volume of the thoracic cage, you're not gonna be able to increase the volume of the lungs, and that's gonna make it hard to move air in. All right, so that's the end of this particular topic, pulmonary ventilation. Remember, that's only one of the processes of respiration. So the next video is going to talk about external respiration. How does that oxygen that we just breathed in, that is now in the air in our lungs, how does that get into your blood at your lungs? How does the carbon dioxide leave the blood at your lungs so it can leave when you exhale?